Hey there, my name is Scott James. I am the founder and board chair of Bainbridge Prepares. This is a presentation about replicating our approach for community preparedness, looking at preparedness through a lens of love rather than fear, and we want to replicate that around the world. Now, every speaker has a bias, so I'm just going to confess my bias to you up front. I want every town, every neighborhood around the globe to be able to think positively about preparedness, not from a fear-based thing, but from a love and community-based perspective. So this presentation is going to share key learnings that we've gathered over the last 9 years of existence for our NGO. That's a non-government organization. And this is where citizens have taken the lead both in instigating and creating this, as well as continuing to run it and lead it, even after we got the professionals from our local fire district and our city hall involved. So let's set some expectations as to what we'll be talking about today and what we will not be talking about. We are shooting this in my home at a social distance because we are in the middle of COVID still, right now in 2020. So we're not going to be talking about pandemic per se, but COVID-19 did give us the ability to stress test what we had been building for the last 9 years for natural disasters that were more appropriate for our neck of the woods here in the Pacific Northwest, namely earthquakes and wildfires. Thankfully, the proper procedure for earthquakes is sheltering in place, and so we were able to take a lot of those lessons and apply it to pandemic as well. So today we're going to cover these three topics on how this citizen-led social safety net, how we created ours and how you can create yours in your town or in your neighborhood. So specifically, we'll talk about recruiting and training volunteers. We'll talk about finding sponsors, particularly within your local fire district, as well as your city hall or your city council, your local governance. And then we'll talk about how do we move folks from minor actions, like say attending a class, to major actions, like actually doing what that class talked about, say preparing a go bag or a shelter-in-place kit. Additional information, direct contact information, PDFs, checklists, all kinds of goodies can be found at bainbridgeprepares.org. I would encourage you to go there, go all through the site, and lift as much as you want to replicate our model in your town. And contact us directly about how we can best be of assistance. So, quick note on my background. I came out of high-tech marketing. I was a software evangelist. I am now a social entrepreneur and a bit of a startup junkie. I'm in the process of building my 9th company here in 2020 since leaving Microsoft. I'm also an urban homesteader and a permaculture geek, and that actually is what led to my journey in preparedness. About 15 years ago, my wife and I went deep into the urban homesteading movement, creating our own urban homestead. That led to about 10 years ago starting to go beyond just our neighborhood into the greater community, the islands that we live on. And that also set the stage for the book that eventually came out called Prepared Neighborhoods about 3 years ago. So my role in the preparedness community, I've got 3 basic roles for the U.S. The first is the book. I'm an author. The book was picked up by FEMA on its first birthday, which was a bit unexpected. It's got a unique focus of neighborhoods as the sweet spot where group resilience happens. And FEMA works, at the federal level to the regional, to the state, to the city, and then kind of stops. Prepared Neighborhoods is doing the opposite. We're starting at the individual level, then going to the group and the neighborhood, and then up to the city where we can meet. So much of what you'll hear me talking about today is that connection with FEMA and the professionals there. So I'm also an advisor because I'm a bit of a geek for positive preparedness, not from a doomer standpoint, but from a let's take care of each other standpoint. And I've had a side hustle since leaving Microsoft of advising executives turned entrepreneurs. That kind of naturally lends itself to me being an advisor for families and individuals and companies on this topic. And then I'm also a founder of Bainbridge Prepares, this super neat group of citizen activists, and community volunteers here in the Pacific Northwest. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we jump into this. Bainbridge Prepares is our unique interpretation of FEMA's whole community doctrine. And whole community you can put in quotes there. That's the name of the most recent thinking from FEMA. This is after years of a very kind of top-down strategy approach to disaster preparedness, which frankly did not work all that well. The quote that you see here is from 2017. I was thrilled to see this because we had been pushing this boulder up the hill for about 6 years at that point. And it was very nice to see new FEMA leadership coming from their perspective saying the same thing, that citizens must be involved, not in a tertiary standpoint, but a primary standpoint. Bainbridge Prepares, we also have like a kind of an extra unique view of preparedness because we are an island. We're a 30-minute ferry ride from Seattle here in the Pacific Northwest. We have a ferry service on one side of the island, a bridge built in 1950 on the other side of the island. Both will not be available after the big earthquake hits. And so because we have that delineation of being an island, it lends itself to the mentality of understanding how community needs to take care of itself in a natural disaster. So a quick timeline to share to mark where you might be on your journey with your efforts in your town or your neighborhood and compared to what ours has been like. So I'm going to steal the vibe of NPR's This American Life, and we're going to talk about Bainbridge Prepares in 3 acts. So Act 1 began about 9 years ago with an idea that neighbors should be able to take care of neighbors, and launched it underneath one of our umbrella agencies here on the island called Sustainable Bainbridge, which I would highly encourage you to take a look at. Find your own version of Sustainable Bainbridge that is in your town, because launching yourself as a program of a larger entity is a terrific way to get a kickstart. I wanted to go this route because when I started thinking about the math of preparedness, it just doesn't pan out. Think about the number of fire and police and other first responders that you have in your town. Now compare that number to the overall citizenry, and you realize, my goodness, this math does not work. If the town is cut off, or if there's a large regional natural disaster where all of the first responders are tapped out and cities can't be mutually supporting each other, the math quickly does not work. The citizens have got to get engaged. And that realization is what inspired the first act of Bainbridge Prepares. So we recruited a dozen folks on that initial team. The local fire district partnered with us right away. They have been strong partners since day one. The fellow you see in the photo here in the uniform is Deputy Chief Jared Moravec from our fire district. I feel like we are joined at the hip some weeks. The fire has been an outstanding partner since day one. So Act 2 of Bainbridge Prepares, we grew the initial team to about 50 folks, and then I stepped away to go do a film project for 3 years. And unfortunately, I did not train the leadership team to maintain that momentum. So the team dwindled to about 5 folks and very little, if any, effectiveness. And I learned my lesson about reinvesting in leadership. So Act 3 started a few years after that. In 2016, I finished up with this film studio. I came back to Bainbridge Prepares. We rebuilt it from about 5 folks to about 100. And we hit a few other big key milestones. The first was we finally got the city to join us, to join the fire district and I in this 3-way partnership. And that was really a tipping point in so many ways. And that was years of working on it. So the woman that you see pictured here next to Jared and I is Ann Lesage. She's our city's emergency management coordinator. She's a full-time employee with a budget for the city. Those 2 things you will have to fight long and hard to get both of those for your town, but it is well worth it. Act 3 continued, and we recruited some large strategic partners like Puget Sound Energy for us, which is for the whole greater Seattle community. That is our utility, electric utility. And that's the fun folks that you see pictured here, along with Reddy Raccoon, our mascot, at one of our events. We also built out a very solid board of directors, and we started elevating and recruiting and training the next set of leadership, including our executive director, Lauren Bast, who is a dynamo of awesomeness. So our current count right now of active volunteers that have been background checked and trained in a variety of credentials based on the teams that you see on the screen here is about 350, and it is constantly increasing. Some of the teams grow faster than others. We'll talk a little bit about that, but it is constantly ratcheting up. So this org chart is a visual of how we organize those teams. Again, you can download a PDF of this from BainbridgePrepares.org. That might be a useful thing to print out and to be able to hand to folks in your town, in your region, to say, hey, here's one model where you've got a city entity, a fire entity, and a citizen-led entity, and they are working together. So a few notes for those of you who are passionate for building new organizations, geeks like me. There's a lot of horse trading going on within these three partners. So in our mind, we try to say there's no sacred cows and there's no egos. We want the team to be most effective where it would need to sit. And sometimes that changes from year to year or season to season. So a lot of horse trading of where do the different teams sit and report up to. We also rotate the face, which entity is currently facing an audience based on need. So that could be different for grants. One grant-making institution might want to just talk to the fire department. One might just want to talk to the citizen NGO. And we can rotate the face of that. Same for audiences for presentations like this. Jared and Ann and I give presentations frequently, and sometimes we're talking to citizens and sometimes we're talking to industry professionals. And so we will rotate the primary face of the three-way partnership based off of that. Two other things to note. One is you'll see that there's some collation happening on this org chart. You'll see some of the teams are listed under preparedness, and some are listed under post-disaster or response teams. Many of our volunteers actually will wear two hats. Before the disaster happens, they're responsible for this type of planning and strategic work. After the disaster happens, they change roles, and they're responsible. They have a different set of responsibilities, even whether it's within that focal group or a completely different team itself. Last thing to note is, notice down the lower left corner, this is version 4.4. In my nomenclature, that means that there's been 44 versions of this org chart. So, and frankly, you would laugh at the first initial org charts that we did back in the day. So this has been 9 years worth of effort and growing and tweaking and changing to see what works out best. Again, as I said, we've had massive support from fire from day one. When the city came on board a few years ago, it was through Ann Lesage's predecessor, Amber Richards, another complete dynamo of positive energy and emergency professionalness, that was just an enormous tipping point for us, and you'll see that in a couple of other slides. So my mention of work of pre-disaster versus post-disaster. Ann Lesage created this slide to show here's what we're doing in the years before the next big earthquake, or as we were able to stress test it with COVID this year, versus what do we do, what do the teams transform into when the disaster actually happens. This is a terrific visual. The PDF for this is also available on the website. It's another useful one to print out and to be able to hand to folks whenever you're thinking about doing the strategic planning for your region. In fact, as COVID hit and I was watching some of the more lackluster responses to this, just even in our own country, it inspired me all the more to get the Bainbridge Prepares organizational model spread far and wide for the benefit of those communities. So these three topics, now that you've got the background of how the partnership works, we'll jump into our first topic, which is about retaining volunteers. So there's a maxim in sales called ABC, always be closing. You may have heard of that. Well, my version of that for nonprofits is ABR, always be recruiting, because both recruiting volunteers and then retaining them is a nonstop job. And the very first person that it starts with is you as a founder or part of the founding team. You have to constantly be on the lookout for new talent, new smart people, new passionate people about this subject. So we're going to go over a few best practices that we've developed over the years. Some of them we made up on the fly, we found it organically. Others we specifically recruited best practices that we learned from other organizations. So the first is to seek volunteers with high impact. Now, by high impact, what I mean is, for instance, when you recruit an executive director of a related nonprofit to your team, to your passion project, you have not recruited just her, but you have gotten her board, her staff, and her small army of volunteers, and her email newsletter, her constituency. That is an example of a high quality, a high impact volunteer. If you recruit a local retail business owner, you're not only recruiting that business owner, but you're also recruiting his daily traffic that goes by, his email list, his people who order from his site online for curbside pickup during COVID. So those are examples of what I mean by a high impact volunteer. As you think strategically about the different types of teams that you want to build out, and side note, there really is no proper order in which you build out the teams. Go with the passion. If you have folks that show up and are passionate about animal care, start the animal care team. If you have other folks that show up and they have passion for what to do with the K through 12, the youth of the town, you start that team. You go with their passion. So you'll remember my note that Bainbridge is an island with ferry service and a bridge service. This image you see here is in fact the outline of our island with 305, the highway running right through it there. This is an image noting the location of our current disaster hubs. We've got 10 you'll see on the map here. By the end of 2020 we'll have 12, which is our target. The idea is that there is a disaster hub that everybody on the island can walk to that's within a 2-mile radius of their home. Because post-earthquake they will be walking. We'll almost assuredly, with our gigantic trees around here, not have passable roads, as well as elevation change from damage to the roads themselves. There's a separate video done by the Disaster Hub team leads, as are most of our team leads. I would encourage you to go take a look at that. You can find those on our website. They'll do deep dives into that. I documented the creation of these disaster hubs in my book, but a quick summary is we borrowed ideas, or you might say I blatantly stole ideas from 3 different organizations around the country. And we combined those best of ideas into something that I think is unique with our disaster hubs. They are interconnected. Their primary purpose is to share information through the ham radios that are sited at each location. Their secondary purpose is to provide medical and psychological aid. That happens through our trained volunteers. And then third purpose is to almost act as a matchmaker. So for an earthquake, for instance, they're completely random. One street can be decimated and the other street, a quarter mile away, is 100% fine. Very little to no damage at all. If both sets of neighbors walk to the hub, one saying, we have extreme needs, we are out of our homes and we can't get to our emergency supplies, the other street walks to the hub and says, we got lucky, we're good to go. Now neighbors can take care of neighbors. Street B can absorb all of Street A in the weeks following the natural disaster, while help from out of region is coming in, because that will take weeks and weeks to get here. Also, again, just to reiterate, the first responders in the town are not going to be available. If you ask your local fire chief or the local police chief what their order of business is for the first day, first week, first month after a large, wide-scale disaster, it is not to come to your neighborhood and make sure everything is okay. They are busy working on the core of infrastructure and a set of critical incidences that they need to work through. It is not taking care of you and me, normal citizens out in the neighborhoods. That's what we can do, is provide mutual aid for each other. So some of our hubs are watched over by a single important strategic partner, like Parks and Rec for us. They account for almost half the locations that you see on our map here. Parks and Rec has been a strong partner for years. They were already an awesome entity, contributing to this great community that we're blessed to live in. And then they have opened up their resources to us continually over and over again. A great example of a strong partner. Some of our hubs are well-to-do campuses where their normal constituencies are very much available for donation dollars to help. And we saw that with COVID, where it came out of the woodwork, people donating time and money and pulling their own N95 masks out of their own bags and donating them to the first responders. Some of our hubs are at the heart of our access and functional needs, our more vulnerable populations. Particularly for us, because our island tends to, as far as demographics, we skew older. And some of our hubs are showing leadership among the faith-based communities. So showing this is what a church or a parish or a synagogue or a mosque can do to be part of that positive preparedness. So another few examples of recruiting high-impact volunteers is the use of seasonal programs. So for instance, as COVID was rearing up in the United States and spring was also coming on, inspiring folks to plant victory gardens was a great thing for our food resilience team to do. So we literally pulled a chapter right out of the old wartime posters about victory gardens and got folks outside putting seeds into the ground. Other examples would be our CERT teams and our WOOFR teams. CERT is Community Emergency Response Team. That is a nationwide program. It's run by the feds. It's usually watched over by local fire or sometimes county Department of Emergency Management. But it is very much citizen driven. I'd encourage you to look for your local version of that, and if you don't have one, do like what we did and start it. And WFR, the other example I gave, WFR stands for Wilderness First Responder. That is a 2-week certification. You can kind of think of it like as an EMT light. It makes it so that if an EMT is on the situation from the fire department, you are actually a useful person to them. And we have WFR trained folks. They're part of our team we call Beamers, the Bainbridge Island Emergency Management Responders. And our Beamers are the folks who report into the disaster hubs to provide that light medical care post-disaster. So some teams can become instantly solid by recruiting the right high-impact volunteer. Communications is a great example. We already had a very active ham radio club. They were doing all kinds of really neat communications for various bicycle races that we had here in town, big auctions run by our Rotary Club to raise money for clean water. They already were doing this, and so it was a very easy pitch to get them interested in being the communications coordination between all of the hubs. Some teams, they'll grow rapidly by bringing on the right team leads, and that doesn't always happen in your first iteration. So as a founder or as a founding team, don't give up. If you launch a team and it fizzles out within a year, find a new set of leads. I really like dynamic duos, I call them. Recruit 2 at a time. That way if one gets sick, the other can cover. If one goes on vacation, the other can cover. And just in general, that dynamic duo can positively reinforce themselves as they are building out their own team. Some teams will grow without any influence of your own. Our Medical Reserve Corps team, which is where we have all the docs and nurses and pharmacists and such, once they got the legal clearance, that team took off like a rocket ship. And all we really had to do was put a few Facebook and Nextdoor posts out there, and they came out of the woodwork. Some teams will struggle to be rebuilt time and time again. We've experienced that with our business continuity effort. Frankly, COVID called a lot of attention to that, which was much needed. And I suspect that coming out of COVID, out of this pandemic, we'll have a much stronger business continuity blueprint for that. By the way, the logo that you see down in the corner there is from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Their business continuity plans are outstanding. That basically is the template. So find a couple of your local leaders and show them the U.S. Chamber of Commerce content and let them take care of doing that promotion. COVID also created a need for some teams that we had no idea. And again, we've been working on this for 9 years. We thought we had thought of every possible team. We had a new team pop up. Anne called them the RAD team, R-A-D, stands for Resource Allocation and Distribution. It was basically a PPE mashup, a mask creation mashup of our local makerspace, which is called BARN, the Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network, our CERT team of volunteers, and a local partner agency of ours called Island Volunteer Caregivers, which has a small army of people doing the grocery shopping for those who can't or should not be going out and about. And that RAD team was created on the fly. And so I'd encourage you, even as you think about, we think we know everything and we've got it all mapped out, to keep an open mind for the need for new inspirational teams to pop up. Inspiration also triggered another one. This logo that you see here in the upper corner, our local theater group is called Bainbridge Performing Arts, BPA, and we approached them about creating a knockoff of the Prairie Home Companion, and so they called it the Bainbridge Stay at Home Companion, and it really helped during those initial shutdown months of getting folks getting humor, getting arts, getting music back into their lives. And it was another example that pre-COVID I could not have named a project that we might have done with the local theater group. But then once COVID hit and we're in shelter-in-place mode, it clearly was a need. That team did a terrific job. And it introduced us to a whole new medium of podcasting. So that's quite a bit about recruiting high impact volunteers. Maintaining them is in a whole different story. There is definitely seasonal fatigue that you will have year after year. We typically would give folks August off, kind of taking a note from Europe, which from a business standpoint shuts down. Every August we would encourage the team leads to tell their teams, let's not meet, let's not work, let's all vacation. We're already here in the Northwest and it's gorgeous in August, so let's not spend a ton of time working on volunteer service. This year we actually gave them July and August off because we were expecting a resurgence of COVID happening in September for back to school on the West Coast. So as you're recruiting organically and you're tailoring, as I said, you're tailoring your growth of the teams to the types of folks and what their passion is that they bring in. You can also gently guide them to what might be priority or what you see and your strategic team sees as priority. And also never underestimate the value of a challenge coin. Small items like this one is from the fire chief that Hank, Chief Duran, gave me early on. It's still in my pocket every day. And it still motivates me in my volunteer service every day. So small things like that, don't underestimate the power of that with keeping your volunteers going year after year after year. Okay, so seasonally, this is another good example. Our child safety team is run by a woman named Kari Murphy, who's brilliant. She actually runs Girl Scouts for most of Western Washington. She's the regional coordinator for the Girl Scouts. In other words, she can organize anything, and yet she also has this creative side of her. She writes the curriculum to earn the badges for preparedness for the Girl Scouts. An unbelievable find, and she lives here on this island. She used to be one of my neighbors, and so we recruited her to run the child safety team. And then we stocked that team with the executive directors from the local private schools, all the youth-facing organizations like Boys and Girls Club, and a representative from the school district. That team decided to put their effort into making a 24/7, 365-day of the year plan, strategic plan for what do we do with our kiddos when the earthquake happens, or when any large natural bioregional disaster happens. And so they created what you see here, this family reunification plan. It relates to the creation of the FRC, which is a Family Reunification Center. We've done a telescoping plan where day 1, day 2, day 3, the schools are doing their normal reunification with parents as they were able to make their way back to the island. On day 3, the remaining kiddos are escorted to the Family Reunification Center, which is at our high school. So now it's in essence, you can think of it as a kid-focused disaster hub. But all the volunteers there have extra deep background checks. All of the principals of the private schools and the public schools are still there, they're engaged. And now you have one location where all the remaining kiddos are, because it will take some parents and guardians days to weeks to get back onto the island if they are off the island when the earthquake happens. The seasonal focus here is back to school season is a normal time when parents and guardians are already hyper aware of, okay, I have things to do. I have to fill out different forms. I need to sign different things for my kids in school. One of those is the classic top 10 list of these are the 10 people that it's okay for my child to go with if I am not available as the parent or guardian. So we have piggybacked onto that seasonal approach, and this team does most of their outbound messaging for back to school. So let's move on to our second topic of what we've learned over the years about recruiting a different type of person, not a volunteer, but we're recruiting partners and sponsors. So we'll revisit one of those photos you saw earlier, Jared and Ann and myself. So your top targets as a citizen organizer is a champion within your fire district and a champion within your city government, whatever that looks like. And with these two entities, you can, and I would encourage you, you should point to our three-way partnership model as something that is working and has worked through multiple roadblocks over the years. This is a proven successful model of FEMA's whole community doctrine. So even with a champion inside of each of those strategic partners, you're still going to experience roadblocks. So just know that that needs to be a form of mutual support, so that even if you're champion within the organization, when they are having a hard time, the other two entities are there to support them. You're there to support them emotionally. If you're having a hard time with budget, you could be there to support them financially. But it's definitely a strong three-way partnership. So when you're looking for this core person inside of fire, inside of city, just know that when at least at the start, it is probably not in their job description. Otherwise, they would already be doing it. If you're lucky enough that you find somebody, it is in their job description, bonus. Use that and you're off to the races. But most likely it is not. So you're going to have to work with their own passion to add this to their job description, whether it's informally at first or formally as you get to it. You also have to look for a personality that's willing to go outside of the box, which for many government servants, what I just said is total heresy. Like that's not cool. But there are those people. There are those rebel rousers, namely these two that you see on this page, that are not afraid to push the envelope within their organizations. If you're lucky enough to be Deputy Chief Moravec, where you've got Chief Turan, who is a rebel rouser in and of himself as chief of the fire team, extra bonus, you're extra lucky. You can move that much faster. That's a big part of why Hank and the fire team were partners from day one. So in addition to this, I'd encourage you to leverage sponsorships and other partnerships from particularly umbrella organizations when you're starting out. Us launching through Sustainable Bainbridge was an enormous help for the first year or two or three. because you're leveraging everything from the email newsletter to other smart people. Sustainable Bainbridge is a working board, so every board member had one or more projects that they brought to the table. But me being able to go there and just tell these folks, hey, I see a hole that needs to be filled within this neighborhood area. Plus, I see a hole related to preparedness because we're in an earthquake zone and a wildfire zone. And to be able to have these really smart people from around that table offer commentary, good, deep, challenging questions, that is just so valuable. You also get to borrow a little bit of their brand halo. SB has a very positive brand halo, and so for the first 3 years, that really gave us credibility. Speaking of brand halo borrowing, Kitsap Community Foundation is the last 3 years we have been borrowing their 501c3 status, where they are our fiscal sponsor. And Kitsap is, by the way, is the name of our county. Most counties have their own version of a community foundation, and it's been super helpful from having Cole Medina, who runs that foundation, ask me and our executive director Lauren very difficult questions, to us being able to borrow from their brand halo and credibility. Super helpful. So I would encourage you to find your local community foundation in terms of supporting your organization. You likely also have one or more service organizations in your town. You know how you drive into a town and you see all the seals of the different service organizations like Rotary, Kiwanis. We are lucky enough that we've got several, including those two. Rotary in particular is the dominant service organization on our island. They have been very generous over the last several years, both with financial support and people power. The check that you see being held up there with Amber Richards, our first emergency management coordinator, is an example. That $50,000 check, that was used to purchase the mass casualty bags, medical bags, that we have stored at all of our disaster hubs, which is what the Beamer team uses whenever they report for duty there. And frankly, you will be bankrolling this yourself for the first number of years. And so the closer you can get to getting into good cahoots with local community foundations and local service organizations, the more you'll be able to expand your budget. So those Beamers, the emergency medical folks, I told you that they go through a wilderness first responder training, 2-week certification. That's actually usually pretty spendy, but Anne, and before her Amber, the city folks use a good chunk of their budget to underwrite that, about 80% of that cost, which then makes it very affordable and attractive for the citizens. And citizens who do that just have to agree that they will report for duty at the disaster hub after their loved ones are secured that they lived with and after their immediate neighbors are secured. Then they walk to the local hub. PSC that you see again here with Ready Raccoon on the screen. They start out by sponsoring a specific annual event with us, and it's expanded to much more, including like their foundation side, purchasing generators for some of our disaster hubs, and more. Some community partners can be specific to a team's focus, such as I mentioned Parks and Rec. We also have our library. Our county library has been a terrific partner. They host all of our classes. They promote all of our classes for us. They've just finished a nice remodel. Not nice, it's gorgeous. And it's a wonderful space that they have us plugged into. You can and should plug into your local service, social service organizations. We're lucky enough that we not only have IVC that I mentioned before for the vulnerable populations, the access and functional needs folks, we also have Helpline House, which is a full-service social work agency here on the island. Those have been strong partners since year 2 when we first began. And we really saw the dividends for that pay out in COVID with the pandemic, because we already had those relationships established, and literally on day 1, they were right there working with us. A few other examples of partners. We have a project called the Bainbridge Food Forest. Again, this is the permaculture geek in me coming out. when we're done with it, it's going to be one of the nation's largest food forests. But that is in partnerships with a local farm-focused NGO called Friends of the Farms, run by the dynamic Heather Berger. She's a classic example of, if you recruit Heather Berger, you get not just her brain, which is amazing, but you get her board, which includes Becca and these other amazing people, and you get their volunteer base and their email newsletter and so on and so forth. I already mentioned Barn, which really came to the forefront when we needed a makerspace to start fabricating PPE. Amazing leadership there, not only at the high level with their executive director, but also at the individual studios, like the technical arts and the fabric arts. And then the one that the other one I mentioned, which was the weekly production, the podcast, the Bainbridge Stay at Home Companion. That was by Bainbridge Community Broadcasting, Bainbridge Performing Arts, and ourselves. And that was information and music and comedy. And they let us put in these little PSAs, these little public service announcements on a positive way to think about weathering this pandemic. So final topic for this overview video of how to replicate Bainbridge Prepares model in your town is, how do we get people to actually do the work? It's one thing to attend a class at the library on, say, packing a go bag. It's another to actually have them say, I packed my go bag. And it's, waiting at the right point of egress for my home. So looking on the left here is a good example of how do we move folks from point A to point B. Attending a class, which is already a big hurdle to get their attention enough to come attend a free class, to doing the work at home. We've had success using this ACT image that you see on the right side of your screen here. This is a graphic that I used for years when I taught an MBA level marketing course. And the goal for every event you hold, every class you do, every outbound email or messaging on social media is to move folks one step further on this ACT continuum. A few things to keep in mind is that within any given audience, you will have folks all over this spectrum. You'll have people ready to jump into the action. You'll have people that are just now pulling their heads out of the sand going, oh, I realize I live in Tornado Alley, or that I've moved to Florida and hurricanes come every year, or that I've moved to the West Coast and there's earthquakes. So you have to have enough positive hooks, interesting positive hooks in your messaging to grab folks, grab their attention, and then move them to that next stage. Stay diligent with this, though, and you will see success to get your audience to that final ACT stage. So we have also borrowed best practices over the years. I would encourage you to do the same. That's why I would love you to just lift everything out of Bainbridge Prepares and recreate it at your town. Particularly like for small group accountability and encouragement, I looked at everything from Books Club to Alcoholics Anonymous to find what was working and then replicate that for thinking about preparedness in a positive, love-centric, not a negative, fear-centric point of view. The 2 weeks ready poster that you see here is another great example of leveraging a best practice, or in this case, a federal or state resource. So we didn't make this cool little infographic. Washington State did. But you see in the middle there, you'll see the City of Bainbridge Island's logo on it. You can do the same thing. Your state or your region likely has these materials already developed. If they don't, come over to Washington State's and borrow ours. And they will give you, it's basically open source. They will give you the native art files so that you can pop your own logo in there and it looks like this is hyper-local to your town. And yet it has been developed by professionals and well thought through. So a few starter ideas for your consideration. You can connect the dots for folks. You can start with personal preparedness for individuals, connect that to neighborhood preparedness for groups, connect that to business continuity for for-profit and nonprofit organizations. Another idea would be working together for bulk purchases for shelter-in-place supplies. You can also do neighborhood-focused teams. In a second, I'll tell you about a really neat program called Map Your Neighborhood That is very much in the sweet spot of citizen-led action. And affinity groups was an early leader for us. So service groups, faith-based groups, even we have a lot of horsing community in our area, and so we reached out to them early on to talk about old school communication methods for when the power's out, and it's going to be out for a month or two. All types of affinity groups that you can look at that happen to already be there and be strong presence in your community. Find ways to leverage them. One final thought is there's some social science of encouraging folks to make a small but public commitment. Post it on Facebook or Nextdoor or whatever their social media is of choice, or make this commitment to friends or their family at the dinner table to say, we are going to get more prepared. We are going to take the next step, whatever that might be. Social science tells us that if you make that commitment, that small but social commitment, you're infinitely more likely to actually follow through and do that. So leverage that. Get folks to make those small actions. So we've done that with a program that's called I Am Bainbridge Prepared, that Anne Lesage, one of her many brilliant ideas. Folks who do make those small commitments, they create this, they come through this household checklist, and if they score enough points on it, then they get this window or a magnet or a static cling that they can display in their vehicle or on their home to help spread the word about they are part of the positive solution. Much of this is based off of the program I mentioned called Map Your Neighborhood. Map Your Neighborhood is the Washington State version of this. It was created by a Washington State employee, Dr. Luann Johnson, when she worked for the state. I thought so much of it that I befriended Dr. Johnson and ended up recruiting her to be my editor on my book. I think she's brilliant. The flip chart is a brilliant idea as well. Most states have their own version of this. And if they don't, again, go look at Washington State and borrow from us. If you have it in your area already, it's probably administered by the fire district. That's what I've noticed as I've given talks all around the country. That's who mostly has found that program and is promoting it. But you can also learn much more about the Map Your Neighborhood program on our website. So just go to BainbridgePrepares.org, click on the Neighborhood tab up at the top, and you'll see a lot of the Map Your Neighborhood program materials and best practices. So we use that as part of this 90-minute starter that I usually end my public speeches with a challenge to the audience. So that's the 90 minutes is take 15 minutes to make that social commitment so that the social science will kick in and they will be more apt to actually do their follow-up. Take another 15 minutes and invite all of your direct neighbors to a Zoom party or post-COVID in the future to a face-to-face party. And then take 60 minutes to sit down with your loved ones, whoever you lived with, and create a reunification plan. And we've got a template for that, a one-page template. That can be made family-friendly. It can be made age-appropriate, whether you have little kids or elderly parents living with you. And it just takes 60 minutes of calm discussion before a natural disaster to talk about how you are going to reunify post-disaster. So once these folks create these, complete these steps, they can get an I Am Bainbridge Prepared checklist, and that's helped us spread the word. So I thank you for your time today about your interest in learning about our business model, our organization model, and how we have created this over the last 9 years. Again, BainbridgePrepares.org, lots of templates, more videos, direct contact information for each of our team leads as well as me and the leadership team. So thank you for your time.